Live, where news comes first. This is ABC-7 Xtra.
There's people across the country that stand in solidarity with Ferguson. As a people, all we have is our voice, and so if we're standing all together, that means something.
Well, I mean, that's the great thing about this country, is if you don't like something, you can speak out against it and protest. And that's great, you know, as long as you do it legally. I don't really understand what looting a liquor store has to do with voicing your opinions.
Violence, looting, and rioting is not a responsible way of expressing those feelings. It severely diminishes the opportunity for healing and positive dialogue going forward.
Those were just some of the opinions we heard this week about those protests. People here locally and around the country speaking up about Ferguson. Tonight we're talking about what we as a country can learn through this tragedy. Good evening. I'm Maria Garcia. Welcome to ABC-7 Extra. For months now, we've been learning more details about that officer, Darren Wilson, and the teen he shot to death, Michael Brown. The case has gripped the nation and forced us to start a conversation about race, about class, about policing, about the role of the media. Tonight, we're going to be delving into all those things. Joining us, Dr. Richard Pineda, the director for the Sam Donaldson Center for Communication Studies at UTEP, also an associate professor there, and Terry Green, president of UTEP's Black Student Union. You can email us your comments and questions now to ABC7extra at KVIA.com. You can also reach us at 915-496-1775. On Twitter, you can tweet me at MariaGABC7 or use the hashtag ABC7Extra. Now, just days ago, we learned Darren Wilson resigned from the Ferguson Police Department. Let's look at the latest developments. 4 months ago, Darren Wilson was thrust into the national spotlight when he fatally shot Michael Brown, an unarmed teenager in Ferguson, Missouri. The killing ignited riots, and the nation remained on edge while waiting for a grand jury to decide whether or not to hand up an indictment against the police officer.
No probable cause exists to file any charge against Officer Wilson.
That decision unleashing more protests in Missouri and around the country this Thanksgiving week. Wilson had been on administrative leave since the August shooting. Since then, the Ferguson Police Department received threats of violence if he remained on the force, prompting Wilson to say in his resignation letter, quote, "I've been told that my continued employment may put the residents and police officers of the city of Ferguson at risk," and adding this, "It is my hope that my resignation will allow the community to heal." But in an exclusive interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos a few days ago, Wilson defended his actions, saying he had a clean conscience and would not do anything differently.
I just did my job. I followed my training.
Brown's mother called Wilson's explanation of the shooting insulting and disrespectful.
I don't believe a word of it.
He's a murderer.
Now it remains to be seen if Wilson's resignation helps calm protests like this one in St. Louis Saturday or ease tensions. Starting our discussion now, joining us again, Dr. Richard Pineda, director of the Sam Donaldson Center for Communication Studies at UTEP, and also Terry Green, president of UTEP's Black Student Union. Thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, let's talk about race. A lot of people talking about it today. It's an issue that's been brought to the forefront. And it has a lot of people divided, especially when it comes to Michael Brown's image. For some, he was a gentle giant. For others, he was a troublemaker, a defiant troublemaker. What is it about this young man that has really touched a nerve with people, and he's become sort of this symbol of these polarizing views? What do you all think?
Well, you know, Maria, I think that the tragedy of all of this is that when we start talking about race in this country, we lack a vocabulary to discuss not only the dynamic of race, but also the tension that arises. I mean, I think that you only have to look back in the last several years to see the number of incidents, especially where police engage with unarmed African-American youth, and the data is pretty stark. I mean, 41% chance of violent encounter between police and African-American suspects. I mean, that says something about not only the nature of the conversation about race in this country, but also the tension and the risk that I think African-American community as well as other minority communities face in their engagements with law enforcement and in their engagement with government in general.
You know, his image has really come into question. Media outlets publishing those images of him stealing cigarettes, pushing an elderly man before the shooting. People calling him a thug. How do you respond to those accusations?
Well, as far as him pushing the old lady and things like that, he was wrong for doing that. But calling him a thug, Seattle Seahawks cornerback Richard Sherman said it best: thug is the new PC way of saying the N-word. You know, you never hear thug used toward any other demographic in this country, only black males.
Mm-hmm. Now, some are calling this a painful reminder of the enduring tension between classes of people, the racial and economic tensions. What has this case, what does it say about the racial tensions and how they've evolved over the years? Specifically, where are we now as a country when it comes to race?
Well, it's interesting because after the riots in Detroit in the 1960s, the president had put together a commission, the Kerner Commission, and the result of their research in 1968 suggested that there was a split between the African American community and whites, and that schism was only going to grow worse. That was in 1968. I think if you look at the visuals associated with what's gone on in Ferguson, the circumstances of this particular incident, other incidents again where there's been interaction that ends up with a fatality, you can see that the conclusions in 68 are really not that different in 2014. I think the difficulty is that race, especially in this country, tends to be very much experiential. That is, that if you haven't experienced racism and you haven't dealt with it, it's very easy to put a block between you and the circumstances and the society around you. And I think once you have experienced it, it's very hard to sort of go back to saying, look, things are okay. The way that people are being treated is okay. I think that's a problem. And I think, again, part of the difficulty with what we're seeing in Ferguson is you have really polarized opinions on what's going on. In the interview that I did for you all earlier this week, we talked about social media. And in some ways, social media has opened the door for people to be able to involve themselves in the discussion, but it's never really a thorough look at the questions of race or racism. It's really just a space for people to take a position on this side of the issue or on this side of the issue, and there's no give. And so all you're really doing is creating more and more polarization, and that's also problematic.
Now, what about the people who agree and say, look, there are clearly racial tensions in this country, but perhaps this case is not a good example about it? I'm sure you've read people who are writing that this particular case is not about race, that you had a young man attack an officer, try to take away his weapon, possibly inside his police unit, and that the officer felt threatened for his life and therefore shot him, and that it had nothing to do with the color of their skin. What do you think about that?
I believe it did have a lot to do with the color of his skin. The demographics of that police department show that. You know, it's 53 officers, 3 are black. So that community is not show that demographic data correctly. Their community is 67.4% black. So there should be more black officers that have relationships with people in the community. It also shows that police officers should police the communities they live in. You know, if you live in a particular zip code, I think you should police there. You know the preachers, you know the business owners, you have a better understanding of the people you're policing. Now, as far as this not being an accurate example of the race relations in this country, I think it is. We've had, in the last few months, a lot of young unarmed black people get killed by police officers, and some of them don't have to do a race, but this particular one did.
Okay, let's talk about that, because I want to talk about policing. Yeah, the Ferguson Police Department, 53 officers, 3 of them are black, the rest are white, when 67% of the community is black. What does it do for that community when the police department does not reflect the community? We know the mayor this week saying he's vowing to make the police department be reflective of the community. But what does it do when you have a majority of a race really patrolling another race, essentially?
Well, I think there's multiple questions here. The first is how to structure policing in communities so that it's reflective not only of the community makeup, but also reflective of the best procedures to deal with diversity and questions of difference. And I think that in any case, police officers have a unique and difficult job. There's no question about that. There's also no question that this can't be the sole example to gauge every police officer that engages in the community. But that said, I think that what you've seen in Ferguson is problematic, not only because of the issue immediately at hand, whether there was an over-risk or an over-push on the role of the particular officer, or if there's questions of how communities can deal with this. And so once this situation starts to unfold, do you have a way to deal with the tension in a way to minimize the escalation? And I think what happened here was the exact opposite. In fact, it sort of seemed like the police went to a rather high level of readiness, and that prompted not only a reaction from the community, but also a reaction nationwide. I mean, so to see those visual images of the police scourge lines walking into the crowds, the use of the stun grenades. I mean, there's a number of things that one looking from the outside would say there needs to be some moderation, and whether that moderation is directly reflective of this question of diversity and trying to balance out how the police force operates, or if it's just to have a better contingency given these kinds of circumstances. Those things have to be at the forefront of the discussion. But I would caution, Maria, that conversation needs to be split. So there's an important conversation that needs to happen about race in this country, and I think that conversation has to be distinct from a conversation of policing. I think that at some point there's clearly intersections, but I think for our purposes, the more that we conflate those two things, I think it's easier for people to say, well, this isn't a good place to have that conversation.
I see. Well, speaking about policing, we saw the images of the protesters, and I think what really struck a nerve with a lot of people are these images of local police departments, often with military-style gear, around these protesters. We know that the Senate is reviewing the federal grants that provide these sort of military-style equipment to local police department. Homeland Security grants have provided local police departments across the country with things like automatic weapons, heavily armored trucks, night vision goggles, even some aircrafts in some cases. Now, some people would argue that local police really have no business with military-style equipment, that it only encourages more violence. What are your thoughts on that?
Being an Iraq veteran, I don't see any need for any police department to have an MRAP, vehicle. You're not dealing with terrorists. You're not dealing with an armed resistance. You're dealing with the citizens that live in this town. You're supposed to protect them, not go to war against them. So I don't see a need for them to have all this surplus military equipment. They are not the military.
Okay, now supporters of the military equipment point out, though, the incident of the Boston Marathon bombing, where the local police had military-style equipment, so they were equipped to deal with this terrorist attack, and that if the federal government doesn't provide this kind of equipment to the police departments, they leave them sort of vulnerable. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, again, the question of policing and policing strategy is probably best left to police departments. But I will say that if you look at those images, I mean, one thing that's certainly clear when you see the police in Ferguson moving into some of these crowd situations, I mean, there is something incredibly menacing about having, as Terry suggested, these MRAPs, the heavily up-armored vehicles, move into place. I mean, if it's about control and not frightening crowds and not instigating a reaction from a crowd, then that's the worst way to do it. And I think that there certainly are important times for police to have the right kind of equipment. I don't think anybody questions that. But in some ways, what I think this has done is facilitated this movement of a lot of equipment and a lot of equipment without the corresponding training. And that really is a larger issue. So if you have departments that are well equipped to deal with these kinds of situations, and they have layers of strategy to deal with these situations, so that the first wave is officers walking into the crowd or officers using other vehicles, that's something. But it seems like the visuals that we got was that an immediate escalation happened, and I think that really puts people on edge. Not only does it create that simmering tension, but I think that it really creates a difficult situation even for protesters to react to police with up-armored vehicles with military equipment.
Okay, we have a caller. We have Celia from Central El Paso. Hi, Celia. What's your comment or your question?
Mr. Green, it's irresponsible for you to say that calling Mr. Brown a thug, which the video shows he was, is the new way to say the N-word. And what's your comment on continuous black-on-black crime and the protesters acting like a lynch mob? Thank you.
Okay. Well, as far as thug is typically only used toward black males. He might have been a misguided youth, a criminal. He did steal from that store, yes. But they also called Richard Sherman, who I said before, a thug. But granted, Richard Sherman has a master's degree from Stanford University, so I guess the context might be an issue there. As far as
She mentioned black-on-black crime.
Black
That's
on black
something
crime.
that we've heard a lot.
Black-on-black crime is an issue that has to be addressed in the black community because it involves black people. Now, crime happens. There's white-on-white crime. There's Hispanic-on-Hispanic crime. But black-on-black crime seems to be the one that gets thrown out there like we're the only ones that hurt each other. And as far as what did she say last?
I think that was about it.
Oh,
Yeah,
about the people acting like a lynch mob.
Oh, that's right.
Okay, yeah.
The protesters acting like a lynch mob.
This isn't the only time that there's been riots or things of that nature. Students at Penn State rioted when Joe Paterno got fired. San Francisco Giants fans rioted when they won the World Series. But civil unrest is something this country has always had. We had some really serious ones in 1921 in Greenwood, Oklahoma City. You had things like that. You know, this country it seems to have a short memory when things of that nature come up. You know, we only remember the good. We tend to forget the bad most part of the time.
And I think the images that Celia and I think a lot of people are thinking about is specifically the looting and then the burning of cars and businesses, the stepfather of Mr. Brown saying, burn this bee down. Yeah. So some people think that there are, in some cases, outside agitators that are using this tragedy to either advance a political agenda or sort of create divisive rhetoric or just wreak havoc.
That may be true and it may not be true. J. Edgar Hoover called Martin Luther King an outside agitator and the most dangerous Negro in the United States at the time. So, yeah, there might be outside agitators, but also the fact that it happens at night. Yes, criminals are opportunistic. You know, they think they can blend in with the crowd because there is peaceful protest going on.
Right.
But the media cameras pan toward the looting and rioting and such.
And we also saw coverage of some protesters who were defending businesses,
were.
Right, and preventing looters from
they
going
said, if you're not here for Mike Brown, you don't need to be here.
Right. We need to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the justice system. We're going to talk more about the protests, so stay with us. If you'd like to share your comments or questions, you can call us at 496-1775. Email us now at ABC7Xtra@KVIA.com. Tweet me at MariaGABC7 or with the hashtag ABC7Extra. You're watching ABC7 Extra, where news comes first. Welcome back to ABC7 Extra. We're talking about Ferguson tonight. Let's go to our phone lines. We have Ruth from Northeast El Paso on the phone. Hi, Ruth. What's your comment or your question?
I have a concern about, we had a young officer who was gunned down, and no one went out and rioted because of an officer being shot. Then we had a constable who was murdered, and it doesn't seem like it's the same judgment for people. We need to treat everybody as a viable person. And I'd like to know what they are going to try to do about this.
Ruth, thank you so much. So Ruth mentions violence on law enforcement officers and how few people tend to mobilize when it comes to that. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I think at the end of the day that the important things to remember are there's a young man who isn't coming home again, and there's a police officer who has something on his conscience. And I think that those are important. We can't lose sight of the fact that individuals involved in this will suffer to a certain extent. But I also think that the premise of Ruth's question is a little bit off. The idea that somehow or another there isn't a reaction when people in law enforcement are involved in incidents I think is a little bit short-sighted. I think that the question that really we need to be talking about is, in these circumstances where race is an issue and where it has a potential impact, we need to be prepared to have this discussion about what circumstances are there. The question earlier about riots, I think, is one that's really interesting. I think that Terry pointed out quite well that we've had a number of incidents that people don't racialize by the nature of the context. So sports riots aren't racialized. There's not an element of that that's brought in to the conversation. But in the cases where minorities have been involved in these riots, the tendency to try to racialize that really grows largely in proportion to the comments. I think the difficulty with that is that there is a function in civil society not only for the discourse about protest, but also the reaction that protest creates. And I think a lot of times in society we forget that the only way for social order to change is for people to push back against the system. And that is a messy process, but it's also a process we have to talk about and not just reduce it down to racialized context to say, well, it's this group of people and this is the way they reacted. I mean, there is a seething tension, I think, in a lot of communities in this country because of the nature of how they're treated. And I think if there's no way to resolve that or have a conversation about that or even come to the edge of understanding why that difference is there, I think you're going to continue to see these kinds of incidents. I mean, we are not, contrary to comments after the election of President Obama, we are not in a post-racial society. This is still a major issue, and this is an issue that we choose not to deal with until there's an extreme situation, and then I think we tend to want to wash our hands of it by saying this is a limited incident or this is something that doesn't have implications across the country. I think it does, very much so.
Let's talk about the justice system. Many people say this is an example of a flawed justice system. The evidence made things more murky for a lot of people, really conflicting witness accounts. Some say the prosecutors didn't question the officer enough. But ultimately, the grand jury believed that the forensic evidence, which by many accounts is the cornerstone of justice, was on the side of Officer Wilson. So is this case really a good example of a flawed system? I mean, should this case really be sort of the epitome, that example of a flawed justice system, do you think?
I think there's other cases that show a flawed justice system better than this one. Rodney King, for instance, where 4 officers beat Rodney King pretty severely, and thus when they got off, you had the riots in 1992, so that one probably showed it a little bit better. This one never got to a trial in open court. But yeah, I think it shows a flawed justice system. The assistant prosecutor, Elizade, given a law to the grand jury that had been deemed unconstitutional for 30 years, things of that nature. And when asked if the Supreme Court supersedes Missouri state statutes, she said, well, we don't want to get into that. That's all you need to know right now. I think, yeah, it shows that we have a pretty flawed justice system.
Okay, we have to take another break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how media influences our perspective about these issues. We'll be right back. Stay with us. Welcome back to ABC-7 Extra. We're talking about Ferguson tonight. We have a comment from Brian. He says, instead of continuously throwing the race card and assumptions around, let's stick to the facts of the case. How about parents start teaching their kids not to steal and disobey police officers? The police had military gear because innocent stores are set on fire and rocks are being thrown at media anchors simply doing their job, and that is from Brian. Another comment from Felipe. He writes, this goes out to either gentleman. Stephen A. Smith asked a very important question. Where is the outrage on black teen murders, especially when you look at the numbers, for example, Illinois, of something that we actually have several emails about this, is black on black murders. We are seeing this a lot in Chicago and Illinois. What are your thoughts on that? Either of you who would like to take this?
Well, it's unfortunate, that young black men choose to kill each other. But we've got to find the source of that, and that's since it's involving blacks on blacks, it's something for the black community that we all need to get together and figure out what it is. But Chicago itself, you got to figure out where the guns are coming from, because guns are illegal in Chicago,
And I guess the confusion from these viewers are, why isn't there more outrage about that?
There is a lot of outrage about that, but since it's it seems like to be like solely a black issue, I think it's more in-house, and seems like black people tend to discuss it amongst themselves at church and things like that. Well, you know, we don't have any media outlets, we don't own any, so we can't put it in the news, and I guess we opt not to.
But Maria, I think that to Terry's point, I think that this question of saying that there's, you know, not a level of outrage, I think is inaccurate, and quite frankly, I think that that's just as misleading, to use the language of one of the commenters. You know, the conversation isn't about saying, look, there's a building on fire here, and by the way, somebody is shooting somebody else down the street. I mean, the conversation has to be about what's in play immediately in front of you, and I think that there is, first off, outrage, I think, in lots of communities about questions of violence and questions of internal concern to these communities. But secondly, that's not a good argument to say we can't talk about race, which is clearly, I think, a major issue. I mean, to suggest that there are these other things that are going on that are somehow more significant, I think deters the conversation from happening. I think it goes back to the point I made originally, which is we don't have a very good vocabulary for discussing race in this country, and I think that it oftentimes becomes very much a way to position groups on the sort of fringe of society and say, well, you know, they have all of these problems. Clearly, that's a situation that they face. I mean, we're talking about structural inequity that's been historically true in the United States, and so to sort of wish that away and say that those things don't exist and that we should be more concerned about looking at how the African American community deals with youth and culture, I think suggests to stick our head in the sand one more time.
Okay, and I want to talk to you about this, Dr. Pineda. We spoke about it earlier in the week about how sometimes social media very often really creates even more of a divide, even more of these very polarizing positions, because sites like Facebook, even Yahoo, even you know, Gmail, really have links and hyperlinks that track what kind of stuff you like, what kind of posts you like, what kind of articles you click on. So if you're left-wing or if you're right-wing, the articles and the posts that are going to come up on your timeline or on any regular page are going to cater to your interests. They're going to be tailored to your perspective. So you have this experience on the internet that's really crafted to your perspective. So if you have one position on this, when you get online, most of the articles you're going to read are going to solidify that position.
Right. Well, and I think that the other issue that comes up, and one that's of significant concern to me and the research that I do, is looking at how Facebook and social media promotes a really shallow level of engagement and activism. And I think that one of the difficulties is that when you have people that are commenting, especially in political situations, and we've seen this looking at elections, we've seen this during times of crisis or controversy, that people tend to use these social media spaces for a very directed kind of social expression. It tends to be very in front and very directed, and it generally sort of lays bare the position of the poster.
Very aggressive.
But that's the extent of it, right? I mean, that's the extent of the comments or the conversations that are put into play, and then you've got people that are bouncing back and forth on pages, either arguing against the comments, although that's generally pretty rare because you tend to have groups of people that are closer to your political perspective and political ideas, or you have people that are just sort of engaging with liking, and this is disturbing to me partly again because I don't think that we are having really full discussions about this or talking about the nuance of what's involved, and instead sort of using this place to kind of plant a flag and say, this is what I believe, I'm absolutely right about this, and if you disagree with me, well, that's your choice. And something that we've seen more frequently in the research is the Facebook ultimatum, which is when people will post in their comments, if you disagree with me, you can unfriend me. And that's becoming more and more frequent, and in some ways it's sort of the antithesis of the idea of having social media, which is where we're supposed to connect and interact. In fact, now people are saying, I'm taking this position, if you wish to be my friend, great. If you don't, then, you know, defriend me or move off my page. So you've all these little interesting microcosms or microclimates of debate that are sort of fizzling out.
Right, and I mean, it is shallow engagement, right? You get on the internet, you say what you want to say, often hiding behind a computer screen, so you can be really aggressive behind that computer screen. But then that's it. I mean, very rarely it leads to actual, you know, organizing a movement or mobilizing. So I guess my question is, how do we regain trust after this? How do we move forward? What are your thoughts on that?
By engaging in dialogue with somebody. That's when you listen to a person, you have to see the humanity in them. And that's what it takes, sitting down and talking. There's a lot of other things that we could do, voting, you know, because a lot of the politicians seem to avoid this subject, you know, race, and so get somebody in office that will address these topics, or you know, preachers get out of the pulpits and get in the streets and find out what's going on in the community, because your church is there for you to heal the community. You know, we'll get out in the streets and do it, but there's a lot of things we could do, but talking and listening more so would do it.
Right, keeping an open mind. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. It's been an enlightening discussion. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you so much, Dr. Pineda. And thank you for joining us on ABC-7 Extra. We hope you found this discussion productive and enlightening, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.